So at some point, what was like one of the first things, I'm just curious for you, that was like an aha, like, oh my gosh, we've heard this or been taught this for years, but this is really what it's saying. And I'm guessing you've had a lot of those, but do you remember like the first one or two?
Yeah, boy, that's a really good question, and it's difficult because there are a bunch of these. Wow, something early. I think, just will be a bit of a generalization, but I remember sitting in my first Bible class and just realizing and hearing that there were things to think about in the sort of core fundamental ideas of the faith, like, okay, Jesus is God. Okay, Jesus is God and man. Well, I remember, learning that was controversial. Like, and how does that work? Where does the soul come from? Learning, like, here are the possibilities, and then not only that, but actually being taken into Scripture, different passages, and learning, essentially how to think through a passage and what the possibilities are. I mean, later on, I can give you the specific sort of watershed moment for me in graduate school, and that was, I relate this in the opening chapter of Unseen Realm. I had taught biblical studies for 5 years. I had 2 master's degrees. I'm in a doctoral program in Hebrew studies. In other words, I'm not a newbie, okay? And I'm sitting there in church, killing some time before the service, and I had a friend who was also in the Hebrew department there with me, and I don't remember what we talked about, but I will never forget the way the conversation ended. He handed me his Hebrew Bible, and he said, "You need to read Psalm 82." In Hebrew. And so I did, and it's not difficult. The first verse is the lightning bolt. It says, Elohim Nitzav Ba'adat El, God, Elohim, very familiar term for God, stands in the divine council. And then the next line is, B'kerev Elohim Yishpot, in the midst of the gods. Elohim there a second time, but it has to be plural because it's in the midst of. Can't be in the midst of one. In the midst of the gods, he passes judgment. And these plural Elohim, these gods, are called sons of the Most High in verse 6. And I'm looking at that, and I thought, how have I never seen that before? That sounds like a pantheon. And it was like, I don't remember any of the sermon, It was like I could not let go of that. It was so alarming. And fortunately, providentially, I had a second thought as I was looking at this. I thought, I bet Jesus knew this passage. I bet Paul knew it. I bet the disciples knew it. There must be a way to understand this and still have a Trinity, still have the uniqueness of the God of Israel, the God of the Bible. There must be a way that this makes sense. And again, I had a lot of Bible under my belt, and I had never seen that. I went off and I looked at evangelical sources. There was a massive new book about the doctrine of God at a very famous professor at a famous evangelical school. He didn't even have Psalm 82 in his index. It was a 600-page book on the doctrine of God. Didn't even have it in his index. I'd go to commentaries, and they'd say things like, oh, the Elohim here, they're just people. Right. So when we go over to Psalm 89, and you have the same setting, a divine council, a divine assembly with the sons of God, it says they're in the sky, in the heavens. Hey, the last time I read my Bible, there isn't a bunch of Jewish guys running around, floating around in the sky ruling anything.
Yeah.
It just didn't make sense. And I discerned really quickly that, okay, this is something that is systematically avoided. And it became my obsession. It became the topic of my dissertation. It just took me down all sorts of roads. And now that I'm on the other side, I can actually say, well, there is a very clear, coherent, answer to this. Elohim it creeps us out because we see the letters G, O, and D, and our brain, because we're Westerners and we're modern, we have all these church traditions behind us. Our brain just assigns a specific set of unique attributes to the letters G, O, and D. That's why you don't put an S on it. It creeps us out. Well, the biblical writer didn't think that way about the term Elohim. How do we know that, Mike? Because we have a PhD, and so we just bow to your knowledge. No, we know that because of how Elohim is used by the biblical writers. There's 6 different things called Elohim in the Hebrew Bible. It's not about attributes. It's just a word that says it's a disembodied spiritual being. That's all. It's a spirit. It's a spirit being. Well, there's lots of those, but there's only one God of Israel. There's only one Yahweh. And I had to figure that out. Something as simple as that, I couldn't find in an evangelical work. It was like nobody had ever thought of it. I had nobody to talk about it. And I mean, so that again became an orienting point in my dissertation. Then when I discovered what I call divine plurality. It's like, well, there's got to be a Godhead. This has to relate to the Godhead in some way. And so that took me, into the fact that early Judaism used to teach a Godhead. They referred to it as two powers in heaven, two Yahweh figures, a father and a son kind of figure. And I thought, wait a minute, the Jews used to teach this until the second century. This is what prepped people in the first century for the Trinity, for Jesus as God, in human form. And I mean, it just took me down all sorts of roads. And I remember sitting in the library, and I'm tracking on this, I'm tracking on everything I just mentioned, and a dozen other topics, and I thought to myself, there's just something wrong with this. I'm sitting here and I have all this Bible under my belt, and I am experiencing the thrill of rediscovery. But I know that the stuff that's just, sort of putting my mind on fire here and really helping me understand lots of things in Scripture, I never heard any of these things in church.
I've never heard. Yeah, I was going to say half of your book I've never heard.
And I know people are never going to hear this. And I just remember sitting there thinking, you know what? I can do that. I can learn this stuff, and I can, communicate this to the person outside the guild, outside the academy. Because whether a lot of people don't realize that even believing, faithful believing scholars, they're truly saved. I mean, they trust Christ. But the way scholars, even believing scholars, talk about the Bible is dramatically different than what you hear in church. And that bothered me, because I thought, you ought to be trying to communicate the really good stuff, the really powerful insights into all sorts of passages. You ought to try to be deliberately, intentionally trying to communicate that to just the normal person. But instead, what we've got is Jesus as the cosmic life coach, on Sunday mornings. We've got the same Sunday school stories, but now they have adult illustrations. Again, my whole thing about Sunday school should not be forever. People are just stuck, and intelligent people, thinking people, know when they're being asked not to think. And I just thought, it's like I was born to do this, because I really cared about it, and I had the tools, I had the training to do it. And so, if I'm about anything, if I can use that, it's trying to, help people really understand Scripture. Well, I have a podcast called The Naked Bible. We call it that because it's the Bible unfiltered. I'm not putting any clothes on it, okay? I'm not filtering it through creeds or traditions or denominations. It's just the Bible, it just by itself, in its own context. And I'm not hostile to those things. I'm a member of a church. I'm an elder. I think that's important. But at the end of the day, creeds and denominational distinctives are not Scripture, and they are foreign contexts to the Bible. Okay, they are not the original context of the Bible, the context that produced the thing. And so this is what I have become sort of about, trying to help people look at the text, just take the text for what it is in its own context, and then, just roll with that. Just roll with that, and you'll be able to see Scripture in a different way, and again, read it again for the first time, that sort of thing. And again, it's not marketing shtick. I say that stuff because that's exactly what happened to me. And again, I wasn't a newbie. I'm in a doctoral program. Okay, but it's exactly what happened to me.
So I want to go to this. At what point, because your stuff, I'm going to say, and I think you're going to agree with me, but some of your teachings, some of your stuff has got to split hairs, and which makes it kind of fun, actually. What was the first time that you taught, or what did you teach that really just kind of got your typical church leader or people just in a frenzy? Because I read through your stuff. You talk about UFOs, the Nephilim, and which I think I'm pronouncing wrong, and which I knew about those. There's so many topics that you talk about that I really think would bother people. That Do you remember your first one, or one that comes to your mind that you taught on?
Yeah, I think in terms of people being troubled, it's probably either the divine counsel in Psalm 82, or this is going to sound really weird, or it was the idea that the serpent in Genesis 3 wasn't a member of the animal kingdom. And we already know that because of the New Testament. Satan, is an angel of light, and he's the devil, and the serpent, But it's amazing how when you actually say or suggest that Eve could have been talking to a divine being, that she knew was not just an animal or something like that. Or then there's different ways to take the Hebrew term nakash. It can be translated shining one, for instance, which is a stock description of a divine being. It can be translated the one who dispenses divine knowledge. Well, he's certainly doing that. He's trying to lead her astray. It doesn't have to even be serpent. It just depends. So stuff like that, even though it's very consistent with what we would call theological orthodoxy. Well, I never heard that in church, so there must be something wrong with it. You're trying to be clever here and deceive me. It's like, no, it's just the text. I'm as scary as the text is. There it is.